You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
And I want to welcome back Leighton Steward. Leighton, this is Brett and John Rappaport. It's always a pleasure to have you on the Final Say Radio Show. And I know it's been a little time, but it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, you bet. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Okay, of course, we're going to ask you to speak slowly and take very shallow breaths so as not to deliver any more CO2 into the atmosphere than you must for this interview.
All right, I'm only breathing out 40,000 parts per million.
Well,
the plants love it.
Of course they do. Leighton, there's something that they call these days the International Conference on Climate Change, and our lovable president, Barack Obama, seems to think that is the first and foremost the war that we should be engaged in, boots on the ground on this one. But there were a couple very big countries, I mean really big countries, who did not participate in this particular summit for a very good reason, and they don't want to sign on to any of these agreements for more good reasons, and that would be it harms the people who live in their country, and it harms their economy. And I wonder why our president doesn't seem to understand what most of the world seems to.
Well, I'm afraid the only conclusion I can come to is that China and India and Australia and a couple of other countries in there that have refused to come to this thing must be more intelligent than we are. They have looked into the science on this and decided that man-made carbon dioxide is not having a significant impact on Earth's climate. Mother Nature is still in charge. She's been in charge for billions of years, and man has not wrested that ability to change the climate away from her yet. If you look at empirical evidence and not these unvalidated, and I stress unvalidated climate models, you find out that the empirical evidence shows that Earth's climate today is not unusual relative to what it's been in the past. The rate of warming we had in the 80s and 90s was no different than it was back from 1915 to the 1940s, before man started putting much CO2 in the atmosphere, and on as you go back. We also know from the ice cores that the temperature of Earth changes first, and then several hundred years later, the CO2 levels change. A cause does not follow an effect. These other countries, I guess, have just decided to look at the real information and not get overly concerned about the impact of man-made CO2. And, of course, the other thing is they're still developing themselves somewhat. China and India in particular. Australia's in good shape. But they don't see any point in beating their own people out of having the cheapest, most reliable energy to use and forcing them to use wind and solar, which currently are the most expensive energies we can use. And that they don't want to commit economic suicide by doing that, even though the United States of America seems like that's the path we're on right now.
Oh, sure. If I could do an analogy, we all know that the stock market doesn't react the same day as the economy either improves or becomes worsened. And there's always a lapse in time. And of course, when you look at planets that are potentially billions of years old, the time lapse is certainly going to be more significant than a day or a week or even a year, as you pointed out. It could be hundreds of years or perhaps millions of years to see the impacts of things that happen. So for them to say that, we've seen these predictions. I believe it was sometime in the 70s that the Earth was supposed to collapse, and then again in the 80s and the 90s and sometime last decade. And now Al Gore's out there and his friends again saying us, if we don't change this now, that we're all going to die tomorrow. And, but I'm still waiting for that to happen, and I'm sure that my generations in future will still be waiting for this to happen. And so you kind of get the point. But here's where I have my biggest trouble. And this climate meeting that they're having today is in preparation of next year's United Nations Summit, which I believe is going to be in Paris. And the president is intending to sign on to an agreement that surely the Congress isn't going to even see, let alone approve. And so I guess I would question, what gives this president the authority to answer on this kind of a thing for each and every American and make them really held hostage by an agreement?
Well, he's a narcissist to start with, which means he actually probably believes everything he says. I'm a geologist. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't get into all the specifics of the law there, but he clearly is set to do something, I guess, that he thinks is going to be beneficial to his legacy in getting this passed. The other thing is, if it gets to a point where he can control energy, he will control the United States of America, because energy is what keeps us going, keeps us running, gives us our electricity, gives us our transportation, etc. And if you can control energy, you can pretty well control the people. And he seems pretty well hell-bent on doing that. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't see into his mind, but just looking at what he's been doing and how he's been dodging what a lot of people thought were constitutional requirements to make some of these changes, he and his general counsel have managed to go in and do them unilaterally. So it's very disturbing, but that's who we elected to be president, even though he had no experience doing anything to run a big government like this, or even a small government, when we elected him to do it. So I guess we shouldn't be too surprised, considering the people that he had grown up with, and many of them radicals on the left.
You bring up a very good point, controlling people, controlling the mind. You know, the problem that I have with this entire process, Leighton, is it is clearly not just about science, and it's certainly not about accuracy, deliberative, and respectful debate about science. I mean, it's very obvious in both the scientific community and in the media that if you don't follow the leadership's way of thinking, you're an idiot, you're a buffoon, you're evil. You might even be a Fox News watcher, right? I mean, it's a huge problem. Right. But you
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, you actually just brought up a very interesting point. If you control the energy, you basically control the most important lever of the economy. But with that, I want to touch on a couple of things. There are a significant number of levers, or maybe I should repeat that differently. There's only a handful of levers that if you can control, you basically control everything. If you control education, if you control finance, if you control energy, and if you control health care, you basically have, and of course you control the military, you basically have the people pretty much enslaved to what you think of doing. And one of my biggest concerns I'd like you to address, Leighton, is that how do you see the politics fitting into this, not just in the U.S., but the fact that this feels to me like a giant violation of American sovereignty that could never be achieved by penetrating our military veil, but in signing these agreements pierces that military veil very effectively, does it not?
Yeah, well, it looks like it certainly can. And what he's doing, I suppose, can be undone because it's not something that's been ratified as a treaty. But it's going to give us a lot of problems for a long time. It's just going to make these future elections that much more serious. If we hand him back the United States Senate, which is all he has to have to get some of these things ratified and done, we're just cutting our own throats on this. And sure enough, America won't really be America anymore. It's going to be...
Now,
yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not just America. But if you look at our... Let's say we take the line. So let's take the suspension of disbelief and say that we're in, if not lockstep, reasonable agreement with this being a quote-unquote problem statement. what is the alternative? Think about what mankind looked like up until the Industrial Revolution: disease, famine, and healthcare. Nothing was effective. Transportation wasn't effective. Healthcare wasn't effective. I mean, warring. We were far more warlike than we even are now. If you think about the impact on humanity, the ability to burn carbon fuels and everything that's derived from that, from chemistry to transportation, etc., has made the human experience infinitely better than it ever was. I'm not sure that's a bad thing.
Better, cleaner, everybody's standard of living is higher. Even the people that we say, are at the bottom of the totem pole here, most of them have televisions, a car. It's spectacular what energy has done for the United States of America in the last 150 years. If you go back a couple of hundred years, people's drinking water was contaminated, and it still is for billions of people around the world. But because we got electricity in, cheap energy, we started cleaning up our water, cleaning up our streets. We started making all kinds of disposable things so we didn't have to go in and hand wash the syringes we got our vaccinations with that a lot of times ended up giving us a disease worse than what we were trying to vaccinate, etc. It's just on and on and on. Energy has been marvelous. The younger generations don't realize that at all. I mean, I didn't grow up 150 years ago, but sometimes it seems like it. Anyhow, that's a whole other story. The other thing that's really bad about what's going on today, in trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere, we all learned in the third grade carbon dioxide is what plants eat. We know now from looking at one of the satellites that's been up since 1979 that Earth, despite us paving everything in sight with asphalt, concrete, buildings, even clear-cutting the rainforest, we are seeing that the Earth is getting greener and greener and still greener for 3 successive decades now since that satellite's been up. That's a real global experiment of what happens when you put more carbon dioxide into Earth's atmosphere. It greens the Earth. Our president, if he really got his way, he'd probably like to see us ratchet it back to what it was at the Industrial Revolution 150 years ago, and that would absolutely brown the Earth. And there are thousands of experiments that have been run by the world's agricultural community to show that. So one of the reasons the gentleman is in office is because a lot of people saw him as the environmentalist because he said, well, I'm going to take care of global warming. He is absolutely not the environmentalist. The true environmentalists have been grossly misled on this issue. There is not one, and I repeat, not a single instance of carbon dioxide being a pollutant. But our president, the Environmental Protection Agency, who works for him essentially, hardly ever says carbon dioxide without saying pollutant in the same sentence. And there's not a single example. I challenge any of your listeners, go talk to any chemistry professor to give you an example, and they can't do it. There's not one. CO2, there'd be no life on Earth without carbon dioxide. And the plants like it most right now.
Well, stowaways in the wheel wells of airplanes find out very quickly what happens when you lose the benefits of a greenhouse effect. Right? We like a greenhouse effect. The Earth would be totally frozen now without it. That is true. I have two combined questions here. So one, and it's very interesting the way you just presented the greening of the planet. It would be my assumption that just from basic human observation, ability for plant matter grows so quickly. Even trees in the context of history and geology grow very, very quickly. But plant matter can grow so fast that you would think that plants would very quickly consume whatever the natural imbalance is. That plants would quickly consume that And the broader question is, you brought up ice core samples. It seems to me that in the interest of the purity of science without politics involved, that ice core samples would be probably the most fair, accurate, historical way of viewing the impact. But so I wanted you to speak to that, but also the way you study those. Isn't that a huge difference? In other words, you were bringing up a pattern of what happens before and after. So even if you're pulling up those samples, if you're not analyzing them honestly, then I would think you could very easily mislead people by using what would otherwise be accurate samples. So if you
that's correct. No, that's always correct. You need to know that your sampling is good. And you've put your finger on it. The ice cores give us the best temperature and CO2 relationship history going back almost 800,000 years of anything else. They go in and they measure ratios of stable isotopes, various isotopes, and then they cross-correlate those with what the paleontologists see in the leaves of certain kinds of trees, because as the CO2 level would rise on Earth, the leaves would have more of these little breathing pores, their stomata. And you could tell when those trees were living in cool times or cold times or warm times or hot times by doing that. And so you cross-correlate all these different indicators to try to give yourself some feeling of confidence that at least you're in the ballpark. The farther back you go, millions and millions of years, then you're more in the ballpark. You're not going to get the paleoclimate exactly right, but you are going to get it directionally correct. And when you go back and look at these old relationships of CO2 and temperature, you don't see this close correlation that carbon dioxide was driving these climate changes. It's just not there. And certainly the Earth now hasn't warmed in anywhere from 16 to 18 years, depending on who you're talking to, while the CO2 level is still going up at admittedly a high rate. And Earth has not warmed at all. And the satellite's telling you that Earth is greening. So CO2 is having an impact, but the impact it's having is good. If you want robust habitats, ecosystems, if you want more productivity per acre so that you don't have to go in and cut down more pristine forest and everything to be able to raise enough food for the people on Earth, all of this is good. And yet the true environmentalist out there, because I guess Governor Romney never even brought this subject up, they thought that Obama was the environmentalist of the group. Absolutely not true. I think Mr. Obama is trying to gain control of what's going on, and he's doing an excellent job of it, and we're the ones at risk.
Well, I agree with you completely. I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up, but you have a wonderful website, and it's called Plants Need CO2.org, and it's simply www.plantsneedco2.org. There's wonderful information on there that you can check out.
Let me give you another one. Let me bring in the cavalry.
Sure.
About 3 years ago, I talked to NASA scientists, even the old Apollo scientists that put our people on the moon brought them back. Mm-hmm. And after I'd made one of these empirical evidence kind of talks, they said, we've been concerned about what's coming out of NASA these days, because NASA is making statements on climate, but they're not showing us any hard evidence to back up those statements. They said back in the days when we were putting people on the moon, if you went to the control center there in Houston, said the sign on the wall said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." So they didn't mess around with all these assumptions that are going into these climate models that are spitting out these catastrophic forecasts that the media loves. So anyway, those guys have now put a team together of 25 or 30 of them made up of physicists, astrophysicists, geophysicists, geochemists, mathematicians, meteorologists, and so forth, the conclusions they've come up with are 180 degrees, exactly opposite of what is coming out of our administration today. And these are bright, bright people. Many of them PhDs, and they certainly have a track record of success.
And you're talking about the right climate stuff.
That's it, and their website is therightclimatestuff.com.
That's right.
Go there
I just posted
look at their 8 or 9 conclusions, and then compare those with what's coming out of the White House and the EPA.
Yeah. I think what's important with the work that not only that you do, but these gentlemen, these other experts who've, dedicated large parts of their lives to studying and researching and understanding these particular issues, is that as a nation, we have an honest intellectual conversation on it, and that any decisions that are made are backed up by facts, not opinions.
That's exactly the way it's supposed to happen, but we find ourselves talking to ourselves because we cannot get debates. Now, there's a real simple reason for why we cannot get any scientific debates on this issue. Unvalidated models do not create scientific data, and that's just the way it is. Any scientist would know that if they pause to think about it for a second. You can't take models that are full of assumptions and come out with something you can trust as scientific data. The other side, I'll call them the warmest alarmists, do not have empirical data, or in other words, real observations of what's happening today and what's happened in the past. They don't have that to lean on in their argument, so they don't want to get into a public debate with us. They know they cannot win a scientific debate with us because the empirical evidence is on our side. And it's just about that simple. The other underlying reason there is they say, well, we're so far ahead right now, let's don't go debate those guys. They may make a few good points and we may lose ground, because the media is backing them up to the hilt with all these catastrophic forecasts they're coming up with.
Well, let's face it. First, it's not good media to say the world is green, plants are happy, trees are happy, birds are singing, and that's our news. That doesn't exactly
That's right. And it doesn't make much news. It doesn't make headlines in very many areas, unfortunately. But that's exactly what's occurring.
Now, the other side of this, and I think this is important to point out, is that the left, who essentially is behind this movement, as well as many of the other key political movements, that is based more on emotion and marginalization and basically sort of ostracizing anybody who disagrees with the status quo. And whether you're talking about climate science or whether you're talking about war on women from a political thing, you see a very common thread here. You either follow exactly what we say the talking point is, or you're evil. And that's one of the problems. Is it seems to me that a lot of people shut up because in the scientific community, how hard is it to get funding nowadays for any type? If you're a research scientist and you don't follow the current green vernacular, who's going to fund you? What university is going to get the funding?
Clearly, don't get the funding. The funding. Mr. Gore started the funding back in the early 90s, going to people, to universities, research organizations, whatever, that were trying to find out the problems that man-made carbon dioxide was causing to the climate. Those dollars weren't going to scientists and asking them, find out what is causing the climate change. And there are about 22 different drivers of climate change, from the sun, orbital eccentricities, and the ocean currents, and greenhouse gases, etc. There are 2 of these different drivers, and they're all working at different time scales. If you look at Earth's history, there has never, ever been a long period when Earth's climate was in any kind of a stable condition. It just can't be that way. There are too many of Mother Nature's drivers that are out there causing it to change all the time. But whether the climate is getting warmer or whether back in the 60s and 70s when it was getting colder and the headlines said we were going into another ice age, somebody's going to make money on that trend that lasts 10 or 15 years or 20 years or whatever. They'll figure out a way to make money. And the environmental extremist groups will make it by scaring the money out of your pocket. If they don't have a cause with a catastrophic ringer to it, they don't raise much money.
Well, it goes to show you how smart a lot of people really are. But I'll leave this conversation with this thought. There isn't a lot that man could do to stop hurricanes and tornadoes and typhoons and earthquakes and volcanoes and all these natural disasters which have wreaked havoc on Earth since Earth became about. And long after we're gone, these natural acts will continue as long as there's an Earth. And I don't care what kind of agreement, how many UNs we form, or what Al Gore and Barack Obama feel they need to sign on to. It's not going to make any difference. It's only going to harm those who really participate. And it's going to change. It's going to change natural and free market enterprise as well.
That's correct. And China and India and Russia and Australia now, et cetera, will just sit back and laugh at us.
Mm-hmm. Well, then they already are.
Right.
Unfortunately. Anyway,
hey, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's great. Thank you for taking so much time, and it's always a pleasure to speak with you. And, of course, we always welcome you back, so please just reach out anytime you'd like.
Anytime. You bet. Thank you, sir.
All right. Take care.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's Leighton Steward, and you could find him he's, first of all, the chairman of PlantsNeedCO2.org. Go to www.plantsneedco2.org, and we've got that up on our social media, so you can go check that out. Great stuff. And, of course, the other website he was referring to is the rightclimatestuff.com. Great group of folks as well.